Hi, everyone, and welcome to this year's SEER Symposium to Genetic Findings, Impact Perceptions of Responsibility, a public virtual symposium. Just a couple of technical notes before we get off the ground. We will be going from 9 to 3 today, and there are 2 breaks. The whole schedule is available online on the SEER's website. Q&A will be run both through the Q&A function, and also you're able to raise hands, and then the moderator for sessions can unmute you for you to ask your question depending on which way you would like to engage. This meeting is being recorded except for one presentation. Dr. Heifetz's presentation will not be recorded, but the rest of them will be recorded, and recordings will be available soon after. If you have any other questions or anything, feel free to contact me. With that, I turn it over to Erik Parens.
Thanks, Ben, and thank you, Ben, so much for all of the careful hard work you've put into making this event possible. Welcome to all of you for joining us today. I think it's going to be a very exciting symposium. As all of you know, geneticists ongoingly have to deal with the fact of pleiotropy. That is, one gene has effects on many phenotypes. And as ELSI scholars, we ongoingly have to deal with the fact of polysemy. That is, one word can have many meanings and can be deployed by different actors to create different effects in the social world. That is, the term responsibility, we are going to find, is going to create a thicket of conceptual questions where we are trying to track who means what, and then trying to determine if genomic information has an impact in the relevant corner of the thicket where we're trying to track their meanings. We are incredibly fortunate that today that in our first full session, philosopher Silke Schicktans will offer one description of this whole thicket of questions where we're trying to figure out who means what and to what effect. Philosopher Lisa Parker will then make comments, and then our moderator, Lucas Matthews, will invite questions from you, the audience. Lucas is our SEER's postdoctoral researcher. Before Silke Schicktans offers her overview of the whole thicket, Paul Appelbaum will give a fast overview of some of our SEER's work in a couple of parts of that thicket of conceptual questions. In the second full session, we will turn to a more in-depth consideration of another part of the thicket. Woo-Kyung Ahn, who is a psychologist, will speak about how genomic information can, in the context of having a psychiatric diagnosis, impact patients and their sense of responsibility. Psychologist Larissa Heifetz will then make comments, and our project manager and research assistant, Isabel Bolo, will invite questions from the audience. In session 3, anthropologist Stina Liu will speak about how genomic information can, in the context of receiving genomic information about a fetus, impact a prospective parent's sense of responsibility. Lawyer Kimberly Mutcherson will then make comments, and then our Hastings Center RA, Ben Wills, will moderate. In the fourth session, medical sociologist and STS scholar Paul Martin will zoom out from considering the impacts of genomic information in the context of a variety of contexts, including psychiatric diagnosis and pregnancy, and he will reflect on what he sees. A little more specifically, how do the impacts on notions of responsibility that have been found across all of the contexts that STS and LC scholars study, how do those impacts measure up to the original concerns about geneticization that we STS and LC scholars articulated at the start of the Human Genome Project? Carlos Novas will then comment, and our Sears postdoctoral researcher Lucas Matthews will moderate. Again, finally, in the last session, philosopher Katie Tabb will facilitate a last round of questions from you, the audience. And throughout the symposium, we are going to be very eager to hear questions from the audience. So it's now my great pleasure to turn the Zoom mic over to the director of our SEER, Dr. Paul Appelbaum. Paul.
Thank you, Eric, and good morning, everybody. And as I get my slides up, let me join Eric in welcoming you all to our conference this year. This is one of a series of annual conferences that our SEER has put on for roughly the last 10 years. And we are delighted that with the roughly 360 people who registered for this meeting, it is by far the largest that we've had. I think that's a tribute to our speakers and to the interest in the topic that we're going to be addressing. And what I'd like to do in my introductory remarks is tell you how we got here, which is to say, how did we come to be sponsoring a conference on this issue of genetics and responsibility. Our SEER, Center for Excellence in ELSI Research, was founded in 2010 with funding from the National Human Genome Research Institute, which we continue to have and for which we're very grateful. We have a particular focus on ethical, legal, and social issues in psychiatric, neurologic, and behavioral genetics, although I think for many of us, our interests go beyond that area. As a psychiatrist by training, I have particular interests in what we call PNB genetics. And we have come to recognize that in almost all of our projects and all the areas we've looked at, and I will show you some of them, that the implications of genetic findings for the ways in which responsibilities are perceived, and I'm using the plural because there are multiple kinds of responsibilities that are relevant here, is a very distinctive, maybe not unique, but distinctive aspect of genetics as it applies to psychiatry, neurology, and behavior, which is to say, as it applies to the brain and the mind. So I want to outline the ways in which we've seen that concept play out in our work and set the stage for what's coming for the rest of the day. And in particular, what I'm going to highlight are three kinds of responsibilities. Responsibilities for one's behavior, both in a legal context and an extra-legal context. Responsibility for health-related outcomes, and responsibility to do. So if responsibility for behavior and for health-related outcomes are responsibilities for something having happened, responsibility to ameliorate a situation is a responsibility to do something in a prospective sense, as we'll see. So to start with, responsibility for one's behavior in a legal context. By way of background, and some of you know this well, criminal defendants may introduce evidence on their genetic endowment and environmental circumstances that may be linked causally to their crime and could potentially be used to mitigate their sentences. And the poster child for this kind of evidence is the low activity monoamine oxidase A allele combined with childhood maltreatment, which many studies have suggested is linked to impulsivity and violence, and some studies have suggested is not linked to impulsivity and violence. So it remains a somewhat contentious finding. And the argument that defendants make in these circumstances is essentially, I am less able to control my behavior than other people by virtue of this combination of gene and environment that I have experienced, and therefore I am less blameworthy for my behavior. So our very first effort as our SEER was funded focused on a vignette-based exploration of the attitudes of the public towards mitigating punishment for offenders, whether in strictly legal contexts or quasi-legal contexts. We used online surveys. We were able to gather large samples in that way relatively efficiently. And we took into account other variables that could affect their judgments. For example, whether the defendant had a previous criminal record, how heinous the crime was. And this was funded, as the center as a whole is, by NHGRI. And our collaborator here was Nick Skurich, who's a psychologist at the University of California in Irvine. And to give you an example of one of 6 different vignettes that we used, this was a criminal sentencing vignette. Participants were told that a person had committed a crime. There was a fairly extensive description of the crime and of this person's defense at trial. We varied the kind of evidence that was provided with regard to causal factors from none to genetic, neuroimaging, or both genetic and neuroimaging. We varied whether or not there was a past record of criminality, and we varied the heinousness of the crime by changing the exact description. And the dependent variable here, what we were looking at as an outcome measure, was the length of the sentence that was imposed. What we found, and it was somewhat surprising given the literature at that point in time, was no effect of genetic evidence on length of sentence, although our respondents were highly influenced by the heinousness of the crime. And whether or not there was a past criminal record, it actually didn't matter whether it was violent or non-violent. These results were essentially replicated across 6 different vignettes with very different circumstances, ranging from murder in the course of a robbery to a college student who gets raucous and overthrows a punch bowl at a campus party. And the results were consistent. Whatever other impact evidence of a genetic predisposition to impulsive and even violent behavior might have, it did not have the effect of reducing people's inclinations to punish that behavior. Now, given that criminal defense attorneys in the United States and in other countries, Italy has had a number of cases of this sort, felt otherwise, and therefore were introducing such evidence in an attempt to help their clients, what might account for our findings? Well, to explore part of the answer to that question, we engaged in a second study comparing the attributions of genetic causes to both antisocial and prosocial behaviors. And the question we were essentially asking in relation to the earlier findings was, could it be that people are resistant to genetic explanations for antisocial behaviors? That is, genetic evidence doesn't affect punishment because people just don't buy the argument. Maybe they don't buy it because they want to preserve the right or the power to condemn and punish the person for their bad behavior. or maybe bad behaviors are simply seen as chosen and not innately driven by one's genetic endowment. This work was funded by the Templeton Foundation and represented a collaboration with Matt Lebowitz, who was our postdoctoral fellow, is now on the faculty at Columbia, and Katie Tabb, a philosopher whom you will meet later in this conference, who is now at Bard College. The design of our initial study involved random assignment of participants to either a pro-social or an anti-social behavior, a good behavior or a bad behavior. And they viewed two vignettes, and we varied the order in which they saw them across subjects. One describing a woman named Jane who encountered an unconscious homeless man on the street, and the other a student named Tom who encountered a bullying incident at his school. And Tom and Jane either responded with pro-social or anti-social behavior. And to give you a closer look at exactly what we were giving people here. So the antisocial condition for Jane, let's take that as the example, rather than approaching this homeless man who is seen to be lying, not moving on the ground, and shaking him by the shoulder to wake him up and make sure that he's okay, Jane took the man's cup of money and left him lying in the parking lot. Whereas the pro-social condition was, rather than taking the money and leaving him lying in the parking lot, Jane shakes him by the shoulder to wake him up and make sure that he's okay. And you can see a similar set of conditions related to Tom. After reading each of these vignettes, among other questions, participants were asked, how much of a role do you think genetics played in Jane's or Tom's behavior in the story that you just read, from no or very minor roles to very major roles? And this is a summary of the findings from that very first study. And as you can see at a glance, in the pro-social condition, people were much more likely to attribute the behavior to genetics than they were in the antisocial condition, and highly significant difference and moderate and pretty good effect size. We have, since that initial study, replicated this finding in multiple studies with a variety of positive and negative stimuli, with by now thousands of subjects. So it has been thoroughly confirmed. Moreover, this dichotomy, this discrepancy in attribution of genetics for the behaviors extends to negatively valenced but not antisocial behaviors. For example, if we describe a disorganized person and a excuse me, highly organized person, the disorganized person, her behavior is rated as less genetically caused than the organized person, even though logically, if there are genes that control organization, they should be affecting each of them equally. In some of our more recent experiments, we found that people tend to view positive behaviors as more natural. They have a pretty positive view of human nature. And people who behave badly and hence unnaturally are stuck bearing the burden of responsibility for their actions, because people just don't buy the equivalence between genetic predispositions and bad behaviors, whether antisocial or negative in some other way. So shifting gears, what about responsibilities for conditions and not behaviors? Our current project, now in its final year, focuses on the impact of returning genetic results to people with autism and their families. And we've been very fortunate here to be able to piggyback on a truly extraordinary study. The Simons Foundation, which is the largest funder of autism research probably in the world, their SPARK study, which is led by one of our colleagues here at Columbia and a member of our SEER, Wendy Chung, is seeking to collect genetic information from 50,000 probands with autism and both of their parents. So more than 150,000 people will have their genetic samples sequenced and genotyped. And our work here, again, is funded by NHGRI and our collaborators, who are multiple. For the data I'm going to present imminently, are Julia Wynn and Bob Klitzman. So among the things we're doing, in addition to surveying a large sample of parents and probands from the study, is interviewing selected parents. And these interviews have been done by Bob Klitzman. And what the interviews have revealed is that prior to genetic testing, many people blame themselves for their child's autism. There's a sense that they did something wrong. And people will say, well, you know, I drank a glass of wine before I knew I was pregnant, and I've worried ever since. That's what happened. That was the cause of my child's autism. Or my husband was working in a machine shop or finishing furniture, and he was exposed to chemicals, or he was older, and that must be why our child is autistic. Genetic findings, causal genetic findings, interestingly, tended to reduce those concerns and the attribution of blame to self. So one man told us, my wife had worried whether she did something, but she worries less now. Or it's some peace of mind. It wasn't the diet soda that I drank. And it's not my son's fault either. It just is. Interestingly, for families who receive genetic causal results, which was about 10% of all the people who've been tested so far, they have a significant reduction in their perception of the stigma that they and their child face compared to parents who did not receive any genetic results. Moreover, parents who get such results are highly likely to share them with other people. And the percentage shared in each of these columns is in green. And maybe sharing it with the doctor and therapist, you would say that makes perfect sense. Maybe even the teacher or the caregiver, other caregiver. But interestingly, a very substantial proportion, 40%, shared the information with a coworker, and 22% with a boss, suggesting to me, at the very least, that these genetic attributions are seen as destigmatizing and taking the blame off the parents for the behaviors of their children, and therefore they want to share this information as widely as they can. Finally, genetic findings can also affect how people perceive their responsibilities to act, to do something. So in the darker shade here are people who did receive genetic results. The lighter shade are people who did not have genetic results. And you can see that in most of these categories, although not all, if you got a genetic result, you were more stimulated in the subsequent period of time, roughly. This is the 1 to 2 month follow-up in an early run of our data to raise money for autism research, look for information about alternative treatments, maybe a tad more likely to look for information about medical interventions, much more likely to volunteer to participate in research, and extremely likely to join an online support group, particularly compared to people without such genetic findings. So such findings can also create perceived responsibilities to do something. So to conclude, the genetic attributions that we've studied related to behaviors and conditions can have complex effects on how people perceive their responsibilities, responsibilities for, as well as responsibilities to. Genetic evidence, as we saw, does not affect the consequences of behavior, probably because people resist the attribution of genetic causation for negatively balanced behaviors. But genetic findings do appear to reduce self-perceived responsibility for, in our case, children's health-related conditions, and also increase the perceived responsibility to do something in a positive sense to address those conditions. And I'm sure all of you are looking forward to the upcoming presentations that will explore and unpack these issues in greater depth. So thank you for being here this morning and for listening.